live. But what Jasmine said in response didn't just silence the room, it shook the country. Her calm defiance sparked protests, national headlines, and a moment now compared to Rosa Parks. What made this response so powerful, and why is the whole nation still talking about it? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blistering glare of congressional spotlights, the chamber felt more like a war room than a hearing. Hearing Room 6B had been retrofitted for high stakes. Microphones calibrated, extra press rows installed, and security doubled at the door. The walls vibrated not with sound, but with pressure, centuries of tension ready to ignite. Pam Bondi sat poised in her tailored ivory suit, her smile sharp as broken glass. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett was a picture of composed defiance. Midnight blue blazer, shoulders back, jaw locked in restrained fury. Between them, the distance wasn't physical. It was ideological, racial, generational, a battlefield carved by history and held together by barely restrained civility. The moderator's voice cracked through the static. This hearing will address federal protections for voting rights, irregularities in ballot access, and broader implications for national unity. The moment the gavel dropped, the tension surged. C-SPAN, MSNBC, Fox, all broadcasting live, their lower thirds screaming with keywords. Election integrity showdown, Twitter hashtags trended before anyone spoke. Bondi and Crockett, voting rights, this is America. Outside the chamber, demonstrators clashed. Flags waved, fists pumped, chants echoed. Inside, the silence was louder than any protest. Every blink, every breath, every flicker of expression was fodder for analysis. Crockett didn't glance at the cameras. She knew exactly where they were. For Jasmine, this wasn't just politics, it was personal. She had grown up watching her parents stand in lines that stretched blocks just to vote, seen polling places vanish overnight, watched rights negotiated like poker chips on the hill. Now she was here, not to plead, but to confront. Yet even in her power, she could feel the invisible weight pressing down. The coded looks, the barely concealed smirks, the knowledge that for women like her, one misstep becomes a headline, one raised voice a scandal. But Jasmine didn't shake. She sharpened. And across the room, Pam Bondi saw it too, something she couldn't bend or bait. That was the energy. Not two women debating policy, but two Americas clashing in real time, and the entire country holding its breath. Then came the first strike, quiet, calculated, and wrapped in the kind of polished civility that makes cruelty harder to spot. Pam Bondi adjusted her posture just slightly, as if preparing to deliver something measured and important, though her smile curled with quiet condescension. "Let's be honest," she began, her voice a blend of courtroom composure and Sunday morning smugness. "What's really threatening our democracy today isn't voter suppression, it's voter abuse. Abuse of the system, abuse of the process, abuse by people who have no right stepping into a voting booth." Her eyes scanned the room, but her words were pointed. "We cannot allow undocumented immigrants or unverified voters to hijack elections, and yet every year we're asked to loosen the rules, to trust more, to question less." She let the sentence hang in the air like a trap, baiting, simmering, dressed in faux logic. "We need stronger laws, not more loopholes for those who think voting is a right handed out like candy." There it was, the trigger behind the calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable was sharpened to cut without drawing immediate blood. The cruelty was buried in the calmness, an attack delivered like a gift. Pam's gaze flicked intentionally toward Jasmine, just for a second. Enough for everyone to notice. Enough to send a message. Then she added in that same sweet, steel-laced tone, "This country was built on accountability. And frankly, I'm tired of seeing it chipped away by people who scream racism whenever we ask for ID." Laughter, not loud but present, rose from a few corners of the chamber. Jasmine sat still, her spine straight, eyes forward. The smirk on Pam's face widened, sensing a reaction that hadn't come yet. And still, Bondi pressed. "You can't build a strong house on soft rules. Integrity means saying no. No to lawlessness, no to chaos, no to bending standards for the sake of someone's feelings. She paused dramatically, like an actress waiting for applause that never quite arrived. And if we start confusing compassion with compliance, we don't just lose elections, we lose the foundation of this republic. She wasn't talking about systems anymore. She was talking about people, about who deserved to belong, who deserved to decide, and who should be pushed quietly to the margins. And just when it seemed like Pam Bondi might stop, she went in deeper, with a smile and a voice full of fake concern. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look angry, but her words were sharp, clear, and designed to hurt without sounding cruel. You know what's really going on here, she said. These days, it's not about good policy. It's about who can play the victim the loudest. She paused, letting the sentence hang like smoke in the air. Then she added slowly, some politicians, let's be honest, especially the ones who come from so-called oppressed groups, have figured out it's easier to get attention by talking about racism than by doing real work. Her tone was smooth, but her message was brutal. She went on like she was giving the country some bold truth. They don't want unity, they want headlines. They don't want progress, they want pity. And anytime someone disagrees with them, they cry racism, as if that ends the conversation. The way she spoke, it was clear who she was talking about. She didn't say Jasmine's name, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew. Her words weren't just general comments, they were aimed like arrows. It was a cheap shot dressed up like a thoughtful opinion, and it hit hard. Then the room broke into applause. Loud, rude, confident. The conservative side clapped like they'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Some of them even laughed. A few leaned back in their chairs with smirks, proud of the moment like they just won something. It wasn't just support, it was celebration. And all of it was being broadcast live on national TV. People all across the country were watching as a woman of color was called a fraud in the most polite, professional way possible. That's when the camera turned to Jasmine Crockett. Her face didn't move. She didn't blink. But her eyes, sharp, calm, full of fire, said everything. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't rattled. She was ready, because this wasn't new to her. She had heard versions of this her whole life, that she was only successful because of her skin color, that she didn't earn her place, that she was playing the race card, and now here it was again, on the record, on live TV, and no one was stopping it. What hurt most wasn't the insult itself. It was that no one objected. Not the moderator, not the committee, not the people in power who claimed to care about fairness. That silence said, "We're okay with this." And Jasmine heard it loud and clear. She wasn't just under attack, she was being dismissed, erased, made into a stereotype. But she didn't speak yet. Not out of fear, but out of control. Because she knew her next words had to cut deeper than any insult, and she would deliver them like truth sharpened to a blade. But Jasmine had heard enough, and now it was her turn to speak. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam the table. What she did was more powerful. She leaned in just a little, her voice steady and low, like someone laying bricks with bare hands. "Let's stop dancing around the truth," she began. "The problem isn't voters trying to cheat the system. The problem is the system cheating the voters." A hush fell over the room. She wasn't shouting, but every word hit hard. "Let's talk about Georgia," she continued, eyes sweeping across the panel. From 2012 to 2020, more than 200 polling places were shut down, mostly in black neighborhoods. That's not an accident. That's a plan. And it worked. It caused confusion. It forced people to drive miles just to cast a ballot. It made voting a burden instead of a right. She shifted gears without breaking pace. "In Texas," she said, "you can vote early, but only if you can find a drop box. In Harris County, where over 4 million people live, officials closed all but one single drop-off location. One, for millions." She looked directly at the chairman. "Meanwhile, counties with less than 100,000 residents got to keep theirs. Explain that to me like it's about fairness." Her tone was clear, grounded in fact, but underneath it was a quiet fire, the kind that builds, not burns. "And in Florida," she went on, "they passed a law making it illegal to hand out water or snacks to people waiting in line, lines that stretch hours in low-income communities. So let me ask you, is that about election integrity? Or is it about making people give up before they even get inside? Her eyes swept across the room again, locking briefly on the cameras. You call that protecting democracy. I call it selective silence. You build a wall around the vote, then act surprised when people stop knocking. Her voice didn't shake. It cut. You say it's about preventing fraud, but the fraud isn't coming from the streets. It's coming from inside the law. She paused, letting that truth settle. These laws, these rules, these sudden restrictions, they're not protecting anything. They're punishing people. And the people they punish always look the same. They live in the same zip codes. They work 2 jobs, take 2 buses, stand in line with tired feet and tired hope. Her voice softened, but the weight of her words only got heavier. This isn't about ID. It's not about rules. It's about fear. Fear of what happens when too many people, black people, brown people, poor people, start voting for change instead of waiting for permission. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her hands folded in front of her, calm but unmovable. Let's stop pretending this is complicated, she said. It's simple. You change the rules to keep the same people in power. You shift polling places, close early voting sites, limit mail-in ballots, then blame the voters for not showing up. Her voice lowered even more. And when they do show up, when they do vote in record numbers, like they did in 2020, you call it suspicious. You call it chaos. You call it fraud. But maybe what scares you most is that it worked. No one said a word. Not yet. Jasmine wasn't just challenging policy. She was exposing intent. And she was doing it with data, with lived truth, with the kind of focus that made it impossible to look away. Her presence didn't just fill the room, it called it out, line by line, lie by lie. The silence that followed Jasmine's statement wasn't empty. It was loaded, tense, dangerous, and Pam Bondi seized it like a weapon. She didn't wait for a question or a cue. She leaned forward with rehearsed urgency, her voice colder now, more clipped, like she'd been holding her breath for the right moment to strike. See? She said, gesturing toward Jasmine with one hand, the other gripping the table like she needed to anchor herself. This is exactly what I've been talking about. This kind of rhetoric, this kind of extremism, it's reckless. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp, cutting through the room like glass under pressure. She's not here to fix the system, Pam declared, eyes narrowing. She's here to dismantle it, to inflame, not inform, to push a radical agenda that paints every law as oppression and every disagreement as racism. The words poured out fast but with control, the kind of control meant to sound like clarity, when really it was calculated distortion. Let's call it what it is, she said. This isn't public service. It's provocation. It's theater. She turned slightly to address the room, voice rising just enough to stir the energy in her corner. And when you encourage people to distrust every institution, to defy every rule, you don't strengthen democracy. You burn it down. A few quiet claps emerged from behind her. The camera cut to Jasmine, but Pam wasn't done. We're not dealing with a leader, she said, almost smirking now. We're dealing with an activist in a suit. It was personal, it was brutal, and it was calculated to flip the story, to make Jasmine the threat instead of the voice of reason, to turn her calm into danger, her truth into chaos. Bondi knew exactly what she was doing, not arguing policy, but framing perception. She was painting Jasmine as unstable, unpredictable, even dangerous, not because of what she'd said, but because of what she represented. And in that moment, every ounce of Jasmine's restraint became an act of resistance. Because to answer that kind of attack with anger would prove Bondi right. And Jasmine knew better than to let someone else write her story. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't rush to defend herself or raise her voice to match the accusation. Instead, she did something far more disarming. She smiled. Not a forced smile, not a political smile. It was the kind of smile that comes from someone who has already survived worse. The kind that says, I've heard this before, and I'm still here. Then she leaned forward just slightly, voice calm, but laced with something deeper, conviction forged in fire. You call me extreme, she said, her eyes locked on Pam Bondi. I'm not extreme. I'm asking to be treated fairly. I'm asking for the same basic rights that my ancestors were beaten, jailed, and killed for even daring to believe they deserved. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rush. Every word was carefully placed, like stone on stone, building something unshakable. You call that radical? She continued. I call it survival. I call it justice. I call it overdue. The room wasn't prepared. There were no coughs, no whispered rebuttals, no shifting in seats. Only stillness, as if time had paused to make room for truth. I'm not trying to burn anything down, she said. I'm trying to rebuild what was never built right in the first place. Her voice was low, but it carried, cutting through air, through silence, through every unspoken rule that said she was supposed to stay quiet, stay grateful, stay small. Then all at once the room cracked open, a gasp, a murmur. Then it rose, voices, reaction, disbelief, even awe. Someone in the gallery said aloud, "She said that." Another whispered, "That's history." On the other side of the aisle, even a few of her opponents lowered their eyes, unable or unwilling to look directly at her. But Jasmine stayed still. She didn't smirk. She didn't soak it in. She was focused, because she knew what had just happened. She had said the thing everyone else had tiptoed around for years, and she had said it without raising her voice, without losing her cool. Outside, the internet erupted. Twitter exploded with clips, looping her words over and over. I'm not extreme. I'm asking for what my ancestors died for. The hashtag not extreme appeared on t-shirts, in classroom discussions, in church sermons before the week was over. People shared stories, posted photos of their grandmothers holding voter registration cards, told the world that they too had been called extreme for simply wanting equality. But none of that was what Jasmine was thinking about in that moment. She wasn't aiming for viral. She was aiming for truth, plain, firm, and undeniable. Something that would land not just in headlines but in hearts. Something no one, not even Pam Bondi, could erase. But Pam couldn't take it anymore. Jasmine's calm, her clarity, her refusal to be rattled, it all chipped away at Pam's control until the mask cracked. Her voice came harder this time, no longer polished, no longer coated in courtroom charm. You know what? She snapped, standing half out of her chair. If you hate the way we run this country so much, maybe you should just go back to Africa. The words fell like a gunshot in the chamber, sudden, violent, impossible to take back. For a split second, the entire room froze. Not a breath, not a cough, not a whisper. The cameras instinctively zoomed in on Jasmine. Her face remained still, too still, not from shock, but from something deeper, something ancestral, something volcanic held behind iron discipline. The air thickened, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. People turned, looking from Pam to Jasmine, waiting, some in disbelief, others in dread. A staffer dropped a pen, a congressman's jaw visibly tensed. Even the stenographer paused her keystrokes. What Pam had said wasn't a dog whistle. It was a siren, blaring, blatant, brutal. And everyone in that room knew exactly what had just been said, and exactly what it meant. Jasmine didn't move. Not yet. Because what she felt in that moment wasn't rage. It was history. It was every courtroom where she'd been doubted, every hallway where she'd been followed, every dinner where someone asked where she was really from. And now it was here, on record, on camera, live on national television. Pam hadn't just insulted her. She had tried to erase her Americanness, erase her belonging, erase her right to even sit in that chair and speak. And Jasmine, she didn't rise to the bait. She rose to the moment. And just when it felt like the weight of history, insult, and silence might crush the room, Jasmine moved. Not with anger, not with haste, but with intention. She rose from her chair like the ground itself had invited her upward. Her movements were slow, steady, but unmistakable, like someone who knew exactly where she stood and exactly why it mattered. She didn't look around for permission. She didn't need it. Every step she took toward the center of that room felt like it was dragging centuries with it. The sound of her heels echoed against marble. Not loud, but sharp, like a gavel striking once and not needing to strike again. All eyes were on her, not because she demanded them, but because something in the room had shifted. Even the air seemed to wait. Then with a voice so steady it cut through the tension like a clean blade, she began. "I was born in Texas," she said, her voice warm but firm, each word pronounced with care. "My father served this country in uniform. My mother served in its hospitals. We didn't ask for special treatment. We worked. We served. We gave. And my ancestors?" She paused just long enough to let their presence fill the room through her. "They were chained, stolen, bought and sold, shipped across an ocean in darkness and fear to build this country brick by brick, field by field. Not because they wanted to, because they were forced to." Her eyes locked onto Pam's, but her words were for everyone. "You say I should go back to Africa?" She repeated, this time not as a question, but as a mirror. "My people were here long before your people ever called this land home. We were here before your family got their piece of the American dream. Ours paid for it in blood. Our backs bent to build cities we were never allowed to live freely in. Our hands grew crops we were never allowed to eat at the same table with. And even now, when we sit in the same rooms, wear the same suits, hold the same titles, you still tell us to leave." Her voice was calm, but the pain beneath it was real and raw and relentless. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, louder now but still clear. "I'm not backing down, and I'm not here to make you comfortable with a past you've chosen to forget. I am here because they never got to be. I am speaking because they were silenced. I am standing because they were told to sit. I am rising because they were crushed underfoot and told to crawl." She stepped closer to the heart of the room. "So no, I will not go back. But if anyone here is trying to take us backward, you will be the one to step aside." And then came the moment. Not an eruption, not a planned ovation, just one person clapping, slow, steady, then another, then another. It moved like a wave made of realization, not noise. It wasn't about agreeing with her politics. It was about recognizing her truth. Even a few lawmakers on Pam's side, those who had stayed stiff and silent until now, clapped softly, almost reluctantly. But they did. The sound filled the room, not loud, but undeniable. Jasmine didn't bow. She didn't smile. She didn't move. She just stood there, tall, centered, grounded, not as someone demanding attention, but as someone who had simply claimed what was already hers, a place in the room, a voice in the conversation, and a name in the story that no one would ever be able to erase again. And just as the echoes of Jasmine's final words settled into the marble floor, something unexpected happened. It didn't come from the front of the room or from behind a microphone. It came from the back, quiet at first, but unmistakably firm. A man stood up slowly, knees stiff, one hand gripping the back of the chair in front of him for balance. He was older, maybe in his late 60s. White. His faded service cap told you what he'd survived. His face told you what he'd regretted. "I used to think like Pam," he said, loud enough for every ear in the room. The chamber turned toward him. "I really did. I used to hear voices like hers." He gestured gently toward Jasmine. "And I thought, there they go again, making everything about race, about the past, about pain." His voice cracked slightly, not with weakness, but with truth. "I served this country. I believed in this country. But somewhere along the way, I confused comfort with patriotism. I thought that being honest about our history meant hating who we are." He looked directly at Jasmine. "But today, I saw something different." He straightened a little, hand now steady. "People like her aren't tearing this country down. They're holding it up. They're carrying weight that we refuse to name." He paused. "She's not the problem. She's the proof we still have a chance to get this right." The room didn't erupt. It breathed, like a lung that hadn't known it was tight until it finally let go. But the shift wasn't over. A second voice rose, gentler but no less resolute. A woman stood a few rows over. Her shoulders were hunched, hair tied in a messy bun, glasses slipping down her nose. She clutched a canvas tote bag full of handouts, red pens, and a half-eaten granola bar. A teacher, and you could tell by her tone, equal parts tired and passionate. I teach high school government, she said, her voice wavering just enough to be real. Next week, we're covering the civil rights movement. I had a lesson plan ready. She held up her phone, the live hearing still streaming on the screen. But now, this is the lesson, not the insult, the answer, the way she stood there, the way she didn't run. My students are going to see that, because this is what democracy actually looks like: messy, painful, unflinching, and brave. People weren't clapping now because it was expected. They were clapping because they needed to, because something had shifted. The hearing had started as a debate, a performance, a policy exercise. But now it was something else, something human. Jasmine hadn't just changed minds. She'd cracked something open, something raw, long buried, hard to name. And suddenly it wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever watched something wrong happen and stayed quiet, and everyone who had ever been told to sit down and stood anyway. And as the chamber slowly returned to a fragile sense of order, the fire Jasmine had lit didn't fade. It ignited something far beyond those walls. What happened in that room didn't stay in Washington. It traveled, fast, raw, and unfiltered. Within minutes, clips of Pam Bondi's words were everywhere. News anchors couldn't look away. Social media couldn't stop replaying it. And the public? They didn't just react, they responded. By mid-afternoon, the switchboards at the Capitol were overwhelmed. Phones rang off the hook, voicemail boxes filled. Aides at congressional offices, some still in shock themselves, sat frozen as one call came after another, each one angrier and clearer than the last. "I'm a Republican, and I've never heard anything so disgraceful," one caller said. "She crossed a line that can't be uncrossed," said another. "My daughter heard that live on TV," a mother choked through tears, "and asked me why someone in government was allowed to say something like that." What had once been a talking point was now a national reckoning. Emails poured in by the thousands. Petition sites crashed from overuse. Twitter flooded with calls for immediate censure. Hashtags like "disqualify Bondi," "she must resign," and "no seat for hate" trended globally. People weren't just angry, they were activated. Former constituents, war veterans, clergy members, teachers, even retired judges signed open letters demanding her removal from the ethics committee, from the floor, from public service altogether. "This is not a partisan issue," one letter read. "This is a moral one." Inside the Capitol, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Congressional leaders, some of whom had remained quiet during the hearing, began holding closed-door meetings. Staffers whispered in hallways, trading numbers, counting votes, checking procedures. Pam Bondi, once smug in her seat, now sat alone, dodging questions, her usual media allies growing distant. The story was no longer about voter laws. It was about her words, her character, her place in power. Because the truth had landed and the people had heard it, and they weren't just watching anymore. They were calling. They were marching. They were demanding something this country had far too often failed to deliver: real consequences for real harm. And as the phones kept ringing and the outrage turned into action, one moment, just 65 seconds long, began to rise above the noise. It was the clip, the now iconic clip. Jasmine Crockett standing tall, eyes steady, voice unwavering, speaking not just for herself but for generations behind her. No background music, no edits, just one camera, one microphone, and a truth too powerful to ignore. At first it spread slowly, retweeted by activists, reshared by educators, clipped into Instagram reels and TikTok duets. But within hours it was everywhere. CNN called it "the moment America stopped scrolling." A commentator on MSNBC wiped away tears and whispered, "That's what courage looks like." On YouTube, someone overlaid Jasmine's words with the caption, "Grace and fire, power and truth." That phrase stuck. People started writing it on signs, printing it on t-shirts, painting it on murals. It wasn't just a quote, it was a declaration. Then came the comparisons. Historians, journalists, even members of Congress began calling it a modern-day Rosa Parks moment. Not because Jasmine sat down, but because she stood up. Not because she was loud, but because she was unshakable. Like Parks, Jasmine hadn't come to make a scene. She had come to tell the truth, and that alone became a revolution. She didn't yell. She didn't insult. She simply stood her ground, in full view of a nation that had too often looked away. And somehow in that stillness, in that control, she flipped the script, turning a moment of deep injustice into one of undeniable strength. Late-night hosts quoted her. Editorials were written about her tone, her posture, the restraint she showed in the face of open hatred. But for the people watching, really watching, none of that was performance. It was survival. It was power in its purest, most undeniable form. And that's why the clip kept growing. Because it didn't just show a woman defending herself, it showed a nation being forced to look in the mirror, and not everyone liked what they saw, but they saw it anyway. Jasmine made sure of that. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth delivered in a voice so steady, it shook the ground. But while Jasmine's truth echoed from classrooms to newsrooms to dinner tables across the country, on the other side of that impact, Bondi disappeared. The woman who once walked into every hearing with cameras trailing her heels, who knew exactly how to tilt her chin for a quote and smile for the headlines, was suddenly gone. No press conferences, no interviews, not even a tweet. When reporters called her office, they were told she wasn't available. When they waited outside committee chambers, she slipped out back doors. When they reached out to her former allies for comment, the silence was even louder. The energy that had once surrounded her, forceful, smug, unshakable, had collapsed into something brittle, fragile. Her name was still in the news, but no longer in the way she had built her career around. It wasn't admiration, it was accountability. And the shift didn't stop with the press. It crept into the hallways of power, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Lawmakers who once praised her behind podiums now avoided walking next to her on the floor. Strategic distancing. Not one statement, but 100 tiny signals. A seat unfilled at a closed-door meeting, a name missing from a co-sponsored bill, a social media post quietly deleted. Bondi had become toxic, and no one wanted the splash to reach them. A senior Republican aide, speaking anonymously, told a reporter, "We're not going down with her. What she said crossed a line we can't spin away." Inside her own party, some whispered about damage control, others talked openly about ethics reviews, and a few, more candid than cautious, admitted what had already become clear. Pam wasn't the victim. She wasn't the brave voice anymore. She was the warning, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is mistaken for permission. And now, in the aftermath of Jasmine's courage, Pam found herself in a place she had never expected to be. Alone, avoided, and no longer untouchable. And as the noise outside Capitol Hill began to soften, from the protests, the headlines, the calls for accountability, Jasmine returned to her office, not to celebrate, not to gloat, but to breathe. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and for the first time in hours, there was no one else in the room. No cameras, no staffers, no microphones, just her, just the quiet. She walked slowly past the desk, the warmth of the late afternoon sun spilling across the carpet, casting long golden lines through the blinds. Her heels finally stopped beside the window, where the city's silhouette rose in sharp contrast to the rawness of what had just unfolded. Washington buzzed on as always, but something had shifted, and she could feel it, not in the headlines, but in her chest. Something different, something earned. She let herself sink into the chair, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders like memory. She rested her forearms on the armrests, then leaned back, eyes fixed on nothing in particular outside. Just the moving shapes of traffic, people walking past, some of whom might have just watched her speak and didn't even realize who they were passing by. That was the truth of public service. It was both historic and invisible at the same time. She had stood in a room built by men who never imagined her standing there. And today she hadn't just spoken, she had endured. And now in this stillness came the silence that followed not fear, but impact. That's when she saw it, a folded piece of paper on her desk, not typed, not labeled, just carefully placed. handwritten. The kind of thing no one sends anymore. Curious, she reached for it. The penmanship was shaky but deliberate, the ink slightly smudged in the corners. It wasn't long, just 5 short lines, but every word felt heavier than the hours she'd just lived. Dear Congresswoman Crockett, I've disagreed with almost everything you've stood for, but today I watched you stand for something bigger than politics. And for the first time, I respected you. Truly, thank you for not backing down. No signature, just the words. No address, just impact. She read it once, then again, slower the second time. Not because she needed to, but because some truths deserve to be heard more than once. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the page. Her eyes, just moments ago, sharp with steel, now softened. Not from weakness, but from release. And then she smiled. Not the kind she gave in front of cameras, not the one she used to hold composure on the house floor, but a real one. Quiet, warm, the kind that didn't need to be seen to matter. She looked back out the window, this time not at the movement, but at the stillness between the moments. Maybe change doesn't come from shouting, she whispered to herself. Maybe it comes from a voice that doesn't shake, even when it should. She said it not for effect, not for drama, but as a reminder. A note to self, a promise kept. Behind her the phones buzzed, emails dinged. Her staff would return soon. There would be follow-ups, interviews, debates, more rooms to enter, more truths to carry. The world wouldn't slow down just because she had made it stop for a moment. But right now in this room, she had space to feel what so many never get the chance to feel after speaking out, peace. She folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and tucked it into the top drawer of her desk, where she kept only a few things. A photo of her grandmother, a worn-out pocket constitution, and now this letter. Because change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a sentence, handwritten, left on a desk by someone who once stood on the other side of the line and decided to cross it. Not for her, but because of her. And that was enough. But as Jasmine placed the letter into the drawer and let the moment settle in her chest, the world outside her window didn't slow down. It sharpened its claws. By the next morning, the headlines had split in two. On one side were those calling her a voice of moral clarity, a figure of courage, a woman who had drawn a line and dared the nation to see it. But on the other side, fueled by fear, resentment, and an empire of outrage, the backlash had begun. It started with talk radio. One host referred to her as a leftist soldier in a race war. Another called her performative, accusing her of scripted victimhood. But that was just the beginning. By noon, digital outlets on the far-right fringe had crafted headlines that were part smear, part conspiracy. Crockett melts down on House floor. Is she fit to lead? Why are Democrats letting race-baiting replace debate? Jasmine Crockett's real agenda. Power by division. Clips of her speech were edited down, stripped of context, her voice slowed slightly to sound more aggressive. A still frame of her mid-sentence, eyes focused, was captured and captioned. Anger, not leadership. That image made the rounds on meme pages and message boards that prided themselves on anonymity and venom. Then came the coordinated wave. Fake accounts flooded her social media with insults, dog whistles, and thinly veiled threats. Some messages were subtle. You're not helping your cause, while others were violent, graphic, and cruel. Her staff logged and reported what they could. Capitol Police were notified. Security protocols were updated, but Jasmine remained calm. Not numb, but practiced. Because when you grow up black and bold in America, you learn to read hate in high resolution. This wasn't new, but it was louder now, faster, algorithmic. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, shoes off, blazer draped over the back of a chair, takeout container half-eaten, her phone buzzed again. Another message. This one read, "You should have stayed in your lane. You brought this on yourself." She stared at it for a moment, thumb hovering over the screen. Then she turned the phone face down, not because she was ignoring it, but because it didn't deserve her attention. Still, the weight was real, not just for her, but for her team. One aide, young, idealistic, only a year out of college, broke down after deleting her fifth death threat from the office inbox. Jasmine put a hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "Don't let the bark shake you. Their fear is loud because their time is running out." It wasn't a pep talk. It was armor. Shared, not spoken. What stung the most wasn't the trolls. It was the silence. Some of her colleagues, people who had once called her brave in private, who had sent text messages after her speech saying, "I'm proud of you," had now gone quiet in public. No tweets, no press statements, no retweets. They were waiting to see where the wind would blow before they raised their flags. The real test, Jasmine knew, was never about the moment itself. It was about what came next. Would people stand by the truth when it was no longer trending? Would they speak when it might cost them? Or would they wait for the fire to die down before stepping back into the light? A well-known cable anchor aired a segment titled "The Crockett Conundrum," posing the question, is her brand of politics inspiring or incendiary? The panel was split. One guest called her necessary, another called her divisive. No one mentioned what had been said to her. No one played Pam Bondi's words. That was the pattern. People dissected Jasmine's tone, her timing, her posture, but not the provocation that came before it. They measured her response like it was a weapon, but treated the insult like a whisper. And that, more than anything, was the old game repackaged again. Hold the oppressed to the standard of saints while letting the powerful fall short without consequence. In the middle of that week, Jasmine received an internal memo. It came from her party's communications office. It suggested that in upcoming appearances, she pivot focus back toward legislative goals and lower emotional intensity to maintain message discipline. She read it in silence, then circled one line in red pen and wrote in the margin, "The only thing I lowered was my voice, and it scared them louder than a scream ever could." She never sent the note back, but she left it on her desk where anyone walking in could read it. That same day, she received a hand-delivered envelope. No return address. Inside was a printout of a social media post, someone calling her a race hustler and the real racist. Taped to it was a sticky note that read simply, "You made them uncomfortable. Good, keep going." It wasn't signed, but she recognized the handwriting. It belonged to a senior aide from another office, a white woman, a quiet ally, another crack in the wall. And the truth was, the backlash meant it had landed. You don't get that kind of resistance unless you hit something real. Jasmine knew it. Her team knew it. Even her critics, deep down, knew it. That's why they were scrambling, not to stop her, but to contain what she had already started. One night she returned to her office after hours, the building nearly empty. She turned on the lamp, opened her laptop, and watched the clip again, not for validation, but to listen, to hear how it sounded without adrenaline in her ears. And there it was, her voice, calm, clear, steady, not perfect, not polished, just true. She leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, and said quietly, "Let them come." Because by then, she had understood something unshakable. The backlash is the proof. The silence is the confession. And the fire? The fire means you're getting close to the heart of something they don't want to face. And Jasmine Crockett had no intention of turning back now. And while the backlash grew louder, more coordinated, and at times almost cruel in its precision, something else was happening. Something quieter, slower, and far more surprising. Not everyone raised their fists. Some people lowered their walls. They didn't post about it. They didn't send donations. They didn't craft long threads on social media. They just paused. They listened. And in that silence, something began to shift. Jasmine didn't know it yet, but beyond the anger, beyond the headlines, people were watching her, not to attack, but to learn. It began with a letter, typed, folded, left at the front desk of her office without a name. "I work down the hall. I've disagreed with you on nearly every vote, but I watched the hearing. I listened. And for the first time in a long time, I saw someone speak without calculation. You didn't flinch. You didn't insult. You just told the truth. I think I needed to hear that more than I realized. Thank you. That same day, Jasmine received a text message from a Republican colleague. Not a friend, not even an ally. Just someone she'd nodded to in passing a dozen times on the floor. The message was brief. I don't agree with everything, but what she said to you was disgusting. If you ever need someone to walk with you through the tunnel, I will. She stared at that text for a long moment, not because it erased anything, but because it meant something had pierced the armor. Not publicly, not loudly, but honestly. Then came the hallway moments. Elevator rides that once sat in silence now filled with awkward greetings. Quick glances, a hesitant, that was something, from a lawmaker who had once brushed past her without eye contact. It was subtle, but it was happening. And then, unexpectedly, came an invitation. An older congressman, known for being deeply conservative, approached her after a committee meeting. His face was hard to read. His voice was quiet. I'd like to grab coffee sometime, he said. No cameras. Just a conversation. Jasmine tilted her head slightly unsure. He noticed. I won't try to change your mind, he added, but maybe I need to change mine. They met 2 days later in a back booth at the Rayburn cafeteria. No staff, no press, just black coffee and space to speak. At first the conversation was stiff, policy lines, old grievances, but then, somewhere between stories of his Alabama childhood and Jasmine sharing how her father used to walk 3 miles to vote, something opened. He leaned in and said, You know, I used to think people who talked about systemic injustice were just making excuses. But when I heard you talk about your ancestors, about not leaving, I don't know. Something about that made it real. I'm not saying I get it all, but I'm trying. Jasmine nodded slowly. She didn't offer a victory smile. She just said, That's all anyone's ever asked for. That you try. He didn't switch parties. He didn't make a speech. But 2 weeks later, when a bill came up about restoring federal protections to polling locations, he broke ranks and voted yes. The press didn't link it to her, but she knew. These moments began adding up, in the most unexpected places. One evening, after a long floor session, a janitor knocked gently on her office door. He held a broom in one hand and a small folded napkin in the other. On the napkin, written in shaky blue ink, were 5 words, You speak for my mother. He didn't wait for a response, just tipped his cap and moved on. Another time, at a town hall in rural Arkansas, where Jasmine had been invited to speak about voting access, a man in a flannel shirt and dusty boots stood up during Q&A. His accent was thick. His arms were crossed. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But when he finally spoke, he said, My granddaddy told me government ain't for us, that it's just for rich folks and people on TV. But I watched that video of you, and for the first time, I felt like someone in that building actually saw us. Jasmine stood a little straighter. I see you, she said, but more importantly, I need you to see yourself in it too. The applause wasn't wild. It was steady, sincere. And yet none of this made headlines. Cable news didn't run features on quiet Republicans voting their conscience. Twitter didn't trend for someone saying, maybe I was wrong. But Jasmine felt it, every day, in the way people looked at her, in the letters that came not with money, but with memories. From daughters telling her their fathers, former police officers, lifelong conservatives, had started asking better questions at the dinner table. From pastors in the Midwest who replaced this week's sermon with her speech and a prayer. This wasn't a revolution with marches and bullhorns. It was a rethinking, a reweaving of what had long been torn. And Jasmine, through steadiness, not spectacle, had become a thread pulling it together. One afternoon, a teacher from Nebraska sent an email. No subject line, just this. Every year I teach about Rosa Parks. This year, my students asked me why we don't talk about the people still doing that kind of work. I showed them your hearing, then I asked them what they saw. One girl said, She didn't even yell. She just stood there like a wall that wouldn't fall. Jasmine forwarded the message to her chief of staff with one note. We don't need everyone, just enough to break the cycle, because that's what these quiet allies were doing, not flipping sides, but flipping perspectives. They weren't becoming Democrats. They were becoming listeners. And that, Jasmine believed, was where real change begins. Not with shouting, not with winning, but with someone who used to look away, choosing instead to lean in. The drawer didn't creak. It simply opened, like it had been waiting. Late on a Thursday evening, long after the last votes had been cast, long after the press pool had filed out, and the building had gone still, Jasmine returned to her office. The air was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It never really was. The echoes of the week still lingered. Every insult, every standing ovation, every awkward handshake from someone who used to pretend she didn't exist. She dropped her keys on the desk, slipped off her heels, and exhaled. It wasn't exhaustion. It was something heavier. The kind of fatigue that doesn't come from walking or working, but from carrying the weight of being first. The weight of knowing that your composure is political, your breath is scrutinized, your voice, when steady, makes people uncomfortable, and when raised, makes them afraid. Her eyes drifted to the top right drawer. Inside were two pieces of paper. Just two. One, a small handwritten note with no signature. The other, an email she had printed on cheap office stock. She hadn't read either in days, but she hadn't stopped thinking about them. These weren't fan letters. They weren't filled with praise. They were quiet, uncertain, and deeply human. And Jasmine understood that those were the voices that mattered most. Not the loudest, but the ones who had to cross something in themselves just to speak. She reached for the handle again, but before she could open it, her chief of staff poked her head in. "You've got mail," she said, a soft grin on her face. "Like actual mail, from the post office. Handwritten." She handed over a thick envelope, sealed with care, slightly creased like it had traveled far. No return address, no staff stamps. Just her name in neat cursive. Representative Jasmine Crockett, United States Capitol, Washington, D.C. She sat back down, turned the envelope in her hands, and slid a letter opener beneath the seal. Inside was a sheet of off-white paper, lined with deep blue ink. The writing was careful, almost formal, the kind of penmanship that told you the writer grew up in a different America. She began to read. "Dear Congresswoman Crockett, you don't know me, you may never meet me, but I've known your face since the moment you spoke, and I haven't been able to forget it. I'm a veteran of the Korean War. I served in 1952. I came home to a different world, tried to live quietly and raised my children the best I could. I voted Republican for over 50 years. I've seen movements come and go. I've seen protests, riots, speeches, elections, and I've disagreed with many people who look and sound like you. That's the truth. But then you stood in that room, and you didn't yell, you didn't curse, you didn't even raise your voice. You stood there like you belonged, because you do. And you told a truth I had spent my life trying not to hear. When that woman told you to go back to Africa, I sat frozen, not because I agreed with her, but because I had heard those words before, at my dinner table, at my lodge, on the front porch with men I called friends. I never said them myself, but I never stopped them either. I stayed quiet, respectable, cowardly. But then something strange happened. My granddaughter was watching that hearing with me, 11 years old, bright eyes, big questions. She turned to me afterward and asked, "Grandpa, would you protect her if someone tried to hurt her?" I said yes, and I meant it. I've watched that clip 27 times since. I don't agree with every word you say, but I now understand why you say them, and I want you to know, something in me cracked open that day. Not broken, opened. You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for a country I told myself I loved, but never fully understood. Thank you for standing when others sat, for speaking when silence would have been safer, for being exactly who you are. With respect, Howard G. Pensacola. Florida Jasmine read the letter all the way through once, then again slower. She didn't cry. She didn't lean back and stare into the ceiling for dramatic effect. She just breathed it in, like oxygen after a long run, like the kind of honesty that rarely makes it into politics, like proof that some things, some people, can change. She folded it slowly, precisely, and placed it into the drawer next to the first. Her fingers rested on the edges for a moment longer. 2 letters, 2 moments. One from a man too ashamed to sign his name. The other from a man who found the courage to try again. The knock on the door came a few minutes later. Her scheduler leaned in. "You're due at Judiciary in 15, she said. "They're calling a review of the Voting Access Amendment." Jasmine nodded. "Got it." She stood, smoothed the fabric of her jacket, and glanced once more at the drawer before closing it with a soft click. As she walked down the hallway toward the chamber, her steps felt a little heavier, but not with burden, with responsibility. Every marble tile underfoot had been laid by someone who never imagined a black woman from Texas would walk them with the law in her hand and the truth on her tongue. Somewhere across the country, a grandfather had turned off cable news and sat his granddaughter down to talk about courage. Somewhere else, a former political opponent was rethinking what leadership meant. And inside the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just walking into another vote. She was walking into the future they had once tried to keep her from entering. And now she wasn't just allowed in, she was leading. And as Jasmine stepped into the committee chamber once more, folder in hand, expression calm, gait unshaken, she wasn't walking in alone. Not really. Behind every step was the echo of names never spoken in that room. Names buried under courthouse bricks, names erased from voting rolls, names who once marched without microphones. She didn't need to say them. She carried them. And though no one could see it, she was never more surrounded. The room quieted as she took her seat. The chair creaked. The microphones blinked red. The hearing resumed. But something about the air was different now. Not tense, not hostile, charged. Not with conflict, but with consequence. Something had changed. Not everything. Not enough. But something. Because every once in a while, a moment cuts through noise like glass through fog. It demands clarity. It forces truth to the surface. Uninvited, unpolished, and undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had stood in one of those moments, and she hadn't just survived it. She had transformed it. The lesson from that day wasn't just about politics. It wasn't just about racism. It wasn't even just about courage. It was about what happens when someone refuses to be small in a room designed to shrink them. For decades, rooms like that had swallowed voices, subcommittees, hearings, testimonies buried under procedure and polite tones. Jasmine didn't shout. She didn't weep. She stood, with history in her throat and steel in her spine, and spoke the kind of truth that burns away the masks people wear when they don't want to admit what they really fear. Because what Pam Bondi said wasn't new. It was just televised. What Jasmine answered wasn't rehearsed. It was remembered. This story reminds us that discrimination rarely screams. It whispers, hides behind policy, behind concern, behind civility. And when a black woman like Jasmine challenges it with facts, with presence, with the unshakable audacity of still being here, the system doesn't just push back, it panics, it lashes out. Not because she's wrong, but because she makes it impossible to pretend anymore. Injustice doesn't end when laws are passed. It ends when power no longer fears being held accountable. And in that room, power was forced to look in the mirror, and it flinched. Jasmine Crockett didn't offer America a comfortable message. She offered it a reflection, not of what it pretends to be, but of what it still is in too many rooms, too many laws, too many hearts. And that's why it mattered, because the truth doesn't need permission, it needs presence. And that day, Jasmine gave it a body, a voice, and a name. She stood not to win an argument, but to reclaim the right to even speak without apology. And in doing so, she taught a nation the difference between silence and peace. Because silence is what happens when people are afraid. Peace is what happens when people are free. The aftermath of her speech wasn't just viral, it was vital. In a classroom in Detroit, a student raised her hand for the first time and said, "I want to run for something." In a church in Mississippi, a pastor rewrote his sermon, starting with, "Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to leave." In a VFW hall in Kansas, a veteran who hadn't voted since '84 registered again, writing in the remarks, "Because she reminded me why it still matters." Across the country, Jasmine's story was dissected, celebrated, criticized, but more importantly, it was felt. It made people ask questions, hard ones, personal ones. It made some people uncomfortable. It made others brave. And for Jasmine herself, the lesson wasn't in the claps. It wasn't in the coverage. It was in the cost and the choice. Because she knew she could have said nothing. She could have smiled through the insult, moved on, been respectable. But respectability never protected the truth. It just made it easier to ignore. So what is the message of this story? It's this. You don't change a country by being loud. You change it by being clear. Clarity terrifies those who profit from confusion. And Jasmine was clear. Clear about where she stood. Clear about who came before her. Clear that pain isn't a punchline. Clear that identity isn't a threat. Clear that silence, especially when it is expected, is the most powerful battlefield of all. She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for the exhausted, the overlooked, the ones told to wait your turn in a country built on stolen time. She spoke for the single mother who works 2 jobs and still gets told she's not trying hard enough. For the black father pulled over for driving a car too nice. For the immigrant child who translates eviction notices for their parents before homework. For the girl in the back of the classroom who doesn't raise her hand, not because she doesn't know the answer, but because she's afraid of how the room will look at her if she does. And maybe most importantly, Jasmine spoke for the people who have never seen anyone like them in a room like that. Until now. This story also reveals a hard truth for those in power. History does not ask for comfort. It demands confrontation. Pam Bondi's words, weaponized with a smile, were not an exception. They were a symptom of a system still rotting at its foundations. But Jasmine's answer wasn't just a clapback. It was a verdict, delivered with restraint, shaped by memory, sharpened by every courtroom where justice was denied because the wrong person dared to ask for it. And when she said, "I'm not going anywhere," she wasn't just talking to Bondi. She was talking to every system, every stare, every silent rule that ever told her to shrink. Her presence was not permission, it was protest. Not the kind that holds a sign, the kind that becomes the sign. And so, if there's one lesson that rises above the rest, it's this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay in the room. Stay when you're insulted. Stay when you're erased. Stay when power dares you to walk out so it doesn't have to answer for itself. Because staying is not weakness. Staying is resistance. And when you stay, when you answer hate with presence, not rage, when you answer dismissal with dignity, you teach the room a lesson that echoes longer than any policy ever will. That truth has roots deeper than fear. That presence is power. That the most powerful revolutions don't start with shouts. They start with someone refusing to sit down. And that day, Jasmine Crockett stood so the rest of us could rise. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Judge John Roberts fined Jasmine Crockett $2,500 for wearing a cross in a federal courtroom. What happened next? She launched a $2.5 billion legal nuke that ripped through the halls of power and exposed a war on faith. This isn't just about religion. It's about power, corruption, and a woman who refused to kneel. Roberts lost everything: his power, his reputation, and any chance of escaping the consequences. So now ask yourself, if they came for your belief, would you fight back or stay silent? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the federal courthouse in D.C., but inside something darker was unfolding. It was supposed to be a straightforward hearing, a public discussion on the legality of prayer in schools and civic spaces. A packed gallery watched, half with boredom, half with tension, as political and legal figures took their seats. Then the room shifted. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett entered, not with noise or fanfare, but with a quiet authority that turned heads. She walked confidently, her presence demanding attention without ever asking for it. Clad in a simple but elegant navy suit, her only visible accessory was a modest silver cross on a chain around her neck. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't political, it was personal. And yet within moments, that tiny cross would become the spark to ignite a legal wildfire. Judge John Roberts, presiding from the bench with the detached chill of someone too long above consequences, noticed the cross immediately. His eyes narrowed, not at a legal infraction, but at what he saw as defiance and symbolism. As Jasmine prepared to take her seat, he interrupted, gavel slamming down with a force that silenced even the murmurs in the back rows. "This court is a neutral ground," he said coldly. "Religious displays, especially those worn to provoke, will not be tolerated." Then, without due process, without a warning, he declared, "You are fined $2,500 for violation of courtroom neutrality and for undermining the decorum of this legal institution." The silence that followed wasn't from respect, it was disbelief. The judge had just penalized an elected official for wearing a religious symbol, in plain view of reporters, fellow lawmakers, and citizens alike. The message wasn't hidden, it was weaponized, and Jasmine knew it. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she stood slowly, deliberately, and let the full weight of the injustice hang in the air. She turned to the audience, then to the bank of cameras now humming with silent energy. The cross around her neck caught the courtroom lights, reflecting not shame, but defiance. Her voice, when it came, was steady and sharp. "If this institution fears a symbol of peace more than injustice itself, then the real threat isn't on my necklace. It's on that bench." Her words didn't echo. They pierced. A journalist dropped his pen. A court officer looked down in shame. The room was still, but history was already moving. What should have been a quiet procedural day had just become the beginning of a national reckoning, and Jasmine Crockett stood at the center, unshaken, unbowed. And that was the moment Jasmine Crockett stopped being a witness and became a weapon. 2 days after standing silent but unbroken in the face of a $2,500 public fine, Jasmine walked into the same courthouse. Not as a defendant, not even as a lawmaker, but as the plaintiff in what would become the most explosive civil suit ever filed against a sitting federal judge. Her lawsuit wasn't reactive, it was surgical, precise, devastating. It wasn't born from rage, it was born from purpose. Jasmine was no longer just defending herself, she was defending every American whose faith had ever been twisted into a weakness, whose beliefs had ever been punished by a system claiming to be impartial. Her legal team filed for $2.5 billion in damages, and every cent of it had a reason. This wasn't symbolic. This was mathematical. This was war. The lawsuit named Chief Judge John Roberts and the Federal Court of Washington, D.C. as co-defendants. The charges were stacked like dynamite, each one more damning than the last. First, a direct violation of the First Amendment, the right to freely exercise religion, trampled in front of a national audience. Roberts hadn't just overstepped, he had bulldozed a constitutional line drawn in blood and history. Second, abuse of power. The arbitrary use of courtroom authority to target a sitting congresswoman with no precedent, no warning, and no legal foundation. He hadn't maintained courtroom decorum. He had enforced personal ideology. Third, defamation. His public accusations implied Jasmine was attempting to provoke unrest or political division simply by wearing a cross, which broadcasted an image of extremism to a watching world. And finally, the most chilling accusation, illegal detainment. What the public didn't know, what Jasmine had kept quiet until that filing, was that after the courtroom confrontation, she had been escorted not to her vehicle, but to a small windowless chamber on the courthouse's lower level under the guise of processing. No attorney was permitted to speak with her. Her phone was taken. She sat alone for 6 hours, without charge, without information, with only a guard outside the door and silence inside it. For Jasmine, it wasn't frightening. It was clarifying. That room, she later told a reporter, wasn't isolation. It was confirmation. When the legal documents hit the public record, it sent a shockwave through the Capitol. The filing itself read like a manifesto of accountability. It cited decades of precedent, Supreme Court rulings on religious freedom, and footnoted every word Roberts had said in open court. It didn't speak in anger, it spoke in fact, and it carried the sharp weight of moral clarity. The $2.5 billion wasn't just punishment, it was a message. A system that allowed such abuse must not only apologize, it must be forced to pay a price it would never forget. Jasmine didn't ask for understanding, she demanded reckoning, but she knew that in a world ruled by narratives and headlines, truth alone was not enough. So she assembled a war cabinet. Patricia Wren was the first to answer the call. A civil rights attorney with a reputation forged in the fires of some of the most brutal judicial showdowns of the last 20 years, Wren wasn't known for courtroom theatrics. She was known for her precision. Her method was always the same: isolate the facts, carve out the rot, leave nothing standing. When asked by a reporter why she joined the case, she didn't mince words. "I'm tired of symbols being criminalized by cowards in robes." She had argued and won cases before the Supreme Court. She had dismantled police departments, shut down private prisons, and exposed backdoor deals between judges and lobbyists. And now she was aiming every ounce of that fury and finesse at John Roberts. At her side, Jasmine placed Leo Ramos, a digital strategist who believed that if a message didn't travel faster than a lie, it wasn't worth sending. Ramos had been the unseen force behind some of the most viral political narratives of the past decade. He didn't just build media campaigns, he built movements. Ramos believed every court case had two battlegrounds, the one with a gavel and the one with a hashtag, and he intended to win both. His first move was brutal in its elegance. He clipped together Jasmine's courtroom confrontation, slowed the footage for impact, overlaid the audio of Roberts' fine, and posted it with a single line of text. A judge fined her for her faith. She fined him for forgetting the Constitution. It went live at 9:14 a.m. It had 1.7 million views by noon. But this was just the beginning. Ramos launched Operation Spotlight, a digital siege meant to expose every layer of the case to the public eye. Every document filed, every witness listed, every procedural move by Roberts' legal team was compiled, summarized, and released in plain English to the public. Legalese was translated into righteous fire. People across the country who'd never read a court filing in their lives were now quoting sections of Jasmine's complaint over dinner. Retired veterans, ministers, teachers, and even ex-judges began posting videos in solidarity. "I never thought I'd see the day when a cross would be treated like a weapon in an American court," one said, voice trembling. "But if it had to happen, I'm glad it happened to someone who fought back." And Jasmine didn't disappear behind her legal team either. She stood front and center, giving calm, precise statements to the press. Her tone was never vengeful, only resolute. "This isn't about me," she told Newsmax in a primetime interview. "It's about precedent. If they can do this to a congresswoman in broad daylight, what will they do to a student? A teacher? A factory worker who wears a cross, a hijab, a yarmulke? When injustice hides in robes, we don't need silence. We need floodlights." The lawsuit was no longer a document. It had become a declaration, not of war, but of limits. It asked a question every American had felt but never voiced. What happens when the very people tasked with protecting freedom are the ones quietly suffocating it? Jasmine's case wasn't just legal. It was emotional. It was generational. It was visceral. And with Wren and Ramos at her side, she had the blade, the shield, and the megaphone. John Roberts had tried to silence Jasmine with a fine. Now the entire world was listening. But as Jasmine's lawsuit lit up headlines in courtrooms, fate handed her something more powerful than outrage: proof. It arrived not with a knock, not with a subpoena, but through an encrypted email sent just after midnight. The sender had no name, only a code: P7-_DC. Inside the message was a single sentence: "You don't know the half of it, but you will." Attached was a folder labeled Judicial Comms_internal. Jasmine's team opened it with caution, and what they found inside made every hair on Patricia Wren's neck rise. 37 emails time-stamped over the course of 7 months, all originating from the internal server of the D.C. Federal Court. These weren't just internal memos. They were strategic communications between Chief Judge John Roberts and a group of senior clerks and presiding judges, laying out a covert initiative that had never seen the light of day. The language was sterile but unmistakable. Terms like symbolic disruption index, faith-based agitation watch list, and dress protocol deviation procedure were sprinkled across the documents like clinical camouflage. But beneath that bureaucratic shell was something far darker. In one message, Roberts instructs his chief clerk to escalate fines for religious symbols during public sessions, especially if associated with known conservative figures. Another notes, do not engage in debate, make the punishment procedural, unchallengeable. But it was the final email in the batch, dated just 2 weeks before Jasmine's appearance in court, that dropped like a sledgehammer. Its subject line was blank. Its body was just 3 lines long. Don't attack the argument, attack the anchor. Aim for the cross, hit them at the heart. The phrase stopped the room cold. Patricia reread it. Jasmine stood frozen, the screen's blue glow painting sharp shadows across her face. That sentence wasn't just cruel. It was intentional psychological warfare, aimed at faith itself. In one stroke, it confirmed everything she had claimed and exposed everything the system had tried to deny. This wasn't a rogue overreaction. It was a doctrine, a directive, a quiet war declared on conscience under the disguise of court policy. For Jasmine, it was no longer just a case. It was a crusade for truth. And now she had the enemy's playbook in her hands. But just when Jasmine thought she had uncovered the full extent of the corruption, another layer peeled back. And what lay beneath was pure political rot. It started with a whisper from a Capitol Hill staffer. Someone on the inside. Someone who had seen too much and stayed silent too long. The message was short. They're not just trying to embarrass you. They're trying to erase you before November. That sentence alone would have been enough to raise alarms. But what followed left no room for doubt. Early the next morning, Leo Ramos received a second encrypted package in his private network, a data file labeled simply CONF Crest Chain. When he opened it, what spilled onto his screen wasn't rumor or speculation. It was a trail of emails, clear, damning, and beyond explosive. They were private communications between Chief Judge John Roberts and Senator Lionel Crest, a well-known political heavyweight and one of the president's most vocal adversaries. Crest was infamous for his backroom maneuvers, but what these emails revealed wasn't just unethical, it was a betrayal of the entire justice system. The first message came from Crest, dated 2 months before Jasmine's hearing. It read, "She's gaining traction in faith blocks. Too clean, too fast. Find a way to dirty her up, quietly." At first, the language seemed like political banter, but the deeper Leo read, the more precise, more calculated it became. Roberts responded with a tone that was far too familiar for a sitting judge and a senator meant to operate in separate branches of power. He wrote, "I'll apply pressure." Not directly. We'll find the right moment. Then came the message that made everyone in Jasmine's war room go silent. It was one line, sent by Crest 12 days before Jasmine walked into that courtroom wearing her cross. "Take her down now. Kill the image. If she stands strong by election season, we all lose." That single sentence wasn't just political, it was surgical. It revealed motive, timeline, and intent. Jasmine's public humiliation, the $2,500 fine, her unlawful detainment, and even the timing of her case, it wasn't coincidence, it was execution. And then, as if to rip away the final layer of civility, another message surfaced in the chain. Crest again, this time bolder. Crucify the symbol, make the cross look dangerous. He wasn't just talking about Jasmine's necklace. He was talking about what she represented, moral authority, faith, integrity, and the ability to unify across party lines. To them, she wasn't a nuisance. She was a threat, and threats had to be neutralized, not debated. The most devastating part wasn't the language, it was the casualness. These weren't conversations held in fear or urgency. They were planned, paced, and cold. A high-level bipartisan conspiracy to silence a rising figure not through argument, but annihilation. Jasmine, an elected member of Congress, wasn't just being suppressed. She was being surgically removed from public relevance by the two pillars meant to balance power in America: the judiciary and the legislature. Crest and Roberts weren't enemies by coincidence. They were collaborators by design. And they didn't just want her career to stall. They wanted her credibility, her base, her message, obliterated before it could take root. When Jasmine read those emails, she didn't cry. She didn't flinch. But her silence was thunder. She stood in her office, arms crossed, staring out the window at a city now teetering under the weight of its own secrets. Behind her, Leo's monitor still glowed with the words that had stripped away any pretense of fairness. "They want to kill the image," she whispered more to herself than anyone else. "Then let them try." She turned slowly, looked Patricia Wren in the eyes and said, "We don't just have a case anymore. We have history in our hands." And once the truth hit the air, the country didn't blink. It erupted. Within hours of the leaked emails between Judge Roberts and Senator Crest going public, the internet caught fire. Leo Ramos released the documents alongside a thunderous, cinematic video montage of Jasmine's courtroom moment, overlaid with the words, "This isn't justice, this is strategy," and America listened. The hashtags Faith on Trial and Jasmine and Roberts didn't just trend, they detonated. Over 2 million mentions flooded social platforms in the first 24 hours, driven by pastors, veterans, civil liberties groups, college students, and even former federal employees. TikToks broke down the case in 1-minute bursts. Instagram Reels played the quote, "Crucify the symbol, make the cross look dangerous," on loop. Twitter became a war zone of testimonies, memories, and rage. One user posted, "My mom was fined for wearing a rosary in court. I thought it was just bias. Now I know it was policy." Another wrote, "They didn't just come for Jasmine, they came for all of us." Cable news couldn't ignore it. By noon the next day, every major network had gone wall-to-wall with coverage. News anchors spoke in stunned tones, breaking down the strategy behind the emails, the abuse of judicial power, and the clear political motive. Primetime panels were no longer asking if Roberts had crossed a line. They were asking how deep the system had buried the blueprint. Meanwhile, the real explosion wasn't digital, it was physical. From Chicago to Birmingham, Phoenix to Atlanta, 12 states saw their streets fill with protesters. In some cities, crowds carried signs with nothing but a silver cross and the words, "I won't hide." Churches opened their doors not for prayer, but for planning. Town squares became forums. One retired Marine in Texas held up his dog tags and said into a megaphone, "They fined her for her faith? Then come find me too." This wasn't just viral, it was visceral. The people weren't just watching Jasmine Crockett's fight, they were marching into it with her. And while the nation rose with signs and chants, the man at the center of the storm chose flight over accountability. In the still hours before dawn, the streets of Washington, D.C. remained quiet, at least on the surface. But deep inside a secured estate in Georgetown, Chief Judge John Roberts was making his final preparations. No courtroom robes, no clerks, no press. Just him, his fixer on the phone, and the silent weight of everything crashing down. In front of him lay a forged passport under the name Jonathan Rayburn, a worn leather briefcase filled with classified court documents, and $200,000 in cash, split into neat stacks and tucked into a hidden compartment in his luggage. His hands trembled, not from fear of being caught, but from the realization that for the first time in his career, he was no longer in control. The plan was clinical: a private jet waiting at Dulles International, a soft landing outside Geneva, Switzerland, and a prearranged residence in a country with no extradition treaty. The villa was already stocked, the cover story rehearsed. All that was left was to disappear, quietly, cleanly, permanently. But Roberts had spent so many years behind closed doors, he forgot what it meant to be seen. What he didn't count on was the power of a nation that had woken up angry and connected. Hours before he left his home, screenshots of his face, sourced from courtroom video, news footage, and even archived judicial portraits, had been plastered across TSA alert bulletins and circulated in private security groups. Leo Ramos's media network had done its job too well. They made Roberts a face no one could miss. And at 4:32 a.m., standing in a security line for private flights, flanked by two travel aides pretending to be part of a diplomatic mission, Roberts was spotted by a 26-year-old TSA agent named Maya Delgado. Tired, underpaid, but razor-focused, she stared at the face, then the ID. The jawline was heavier, the eyes more sunken, but the match was unmistakable. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She reached under her desk and pressed the silent notification trigger, a tiny gray button beneath the scanner. Within 3 minutes, federal marshals, already posted in the airport after being tipped off by internal DOJ contacts, moved in. Their footsteps weren't loud, but deliberate. Roberts turned just as he heard one of them call out his fake name. "Jonathan Rayburn? Sir, step aside, please." The panic was immediate. He tried to talk, tried to flash some forgotten badge, some meaningless document, but it was too late. One officer grabbed the briefcase, another grabbed his shoulder, a third twisted his arms behind his back and snapped the cuffs into place, hard and fast. He shouted something muffled. "I'm a federal!" But it didn't matter. The system he once commanded had come full circle, and this time it was gripping his wrists. The scene was caught by a business traveler standing nearby, who fumbled for their phone and hit record just as Roberts was being forced to his knees. The man's once impeccable suit was wrinkled. His glasses fell from his face and cracked on the tiled floor. His passport tumbled beside him, face down, revealing the fake alias in sharp black ink. There was no press, no podium, just the harsh light of the terminal and the unmistakable click of the cuffs, an echo of justice long delayed. As Roberts was dragged to his feet and led away, the recording captured his vacant stare, his refusal to meet anyone's eyes. The man who once judged others in silence was now the subject of every lens in the room. By the time the footage hit social media, less than 30 minutes later, it was already too late for damage control. The caption under the viral video read simply, "When the judge becomes the defendant." Another version spread with chilling clarity, "No robe, no bench, no escape." Within 6 hours, it surpassed 15 million views. Talk shows, news cycles, and podcasts exploded with commentary. People didn't just watch it. They replayed it, analyzed it, memorized it. For some, it was justice. For others, it was closure. But for many, it was the first time they believed the system might actually correct itself. And back in her office, surrounded by her legal team and glowing screens, Jasmine Crockett watched the footage with silent focus. She didn't smile. She didn't cheer. Instead, she leaned forward, paused the video on the frame where Roberts was being led away in cuffs, and whispered, "That's what accountability looks like. No anger, no gloating, just truth. Cold, real, and finally undeniable." And after the cuffs, the cameras, and the collapse of the illusion, came the reckoning in court. The trial, the court called 12 witnesses, but each one felt like the opening of a vault long sealed shut. The first to take the stand was Malcolm Price, a former bailiff under Roberts' administration. His testimony hit like the first roll of thunder. "We were told not to allow anyone into court with overt religious displays," he said. "Not for safety, not for security, but for optics." Then came Sandra Lee, a former judicial clerk, who held up an old printed memo she'd saved from a staff-wide email. The highlighted instruction: "Symbols of belief compromise neutrality. Remove them quietly." With each new witness, the courtroom's atmosphere grew heavier, not louder. The silence of undeniable truth settling in the bones of every spectator. Testimonies detailed how Roberts pushed fines, dress codes, even seating arrangements that subtly but consistently punished those who wore faith openly, particularly Christian and conservative individuals. But it was Andrea Holt, the longtime court clerk with graying hair and a voice like dry paper, who turned the entire trial on its axis. She stepped up to the stand holding something no one expected: a worn, leather-bound notebook. Its edges were frayed, its pages creased and soft from years of use. She placed it gently on the witness stand, opened it slowly, and looked the judge in the eye. These are my notes, she said. 5 years worth. What followed was not a dramatic accusation, but a quiet avalanche. Holt flipped through the pages, reading date after date, case after case, each one a small story of injustice. February 18th, 2020, woman asked to remove necklace with cross. May 6th, 2021. Teen fined $300 for wearing Jesus Saves shirt. August 29th, 2022. Pastor's Bible ruled disruptive during testimony. For 45 minutes, Holt read from that notebook. The prosecution didn't interrupt. The defense didn't object. The room didn't even blink. With every line, Robert's actions transformed from questionable choices to a calculated pattern of faith-based discrimination. By the time she reached the final entry, December 3rd, 2023, cross necklace worn by Jasmine Crockett, fine, $2,500. Justification, violation of neutrality. The courtroom was breathless. Holt closed the book, her hands trembling, and said, I kept this because I knew one day someone would need proof. I didn't think it would take this long, but I'm glad I lived to see the truth spoken aloud. That notebook wasn't just evidence. It was a funeral bell for the culture of quiet repression that had taken root in one of the country's most powerful legal institutions. Every scribbled note was a moment someone had been told to be less visible, less faithful, less themselves. And every single one of those stories now stood on the record, etched into the official transcript of a courtroom that had once silenced them. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't cry. But she nodded just once as Andrea Holt stepped down from the witness stand and walked past her. A nod between two women who had waited too long, fought too hard, and refused to go unheard. Justice wasn't coming. It had arrived, and it was documented in ink. And after the witnesses spoke and the ledger of injustice was laid bare, there was only one voice left the courtroom needed to hear. Jasmine Crockett's. The moment she stood, the entire room held its breath. She didn't flinch. She didn't waver. She moved with the gravity of a woman who had carried the weight of a nation's silence on her back and was now ready to put it down. The courtroom, packed wall to wall with press, legal scholars, victims, and believers, fell into a hush that felt almost sacred. Jasmine walked slowly to the stand. No papers in hand, no prepared speech, just her presence, steady, unshakable. She took the oath, not for legal necessity, but as a symbolic act, a woman of faith swearing to truth in the very room that once tried to silence her for it. When she sat, her eyes found Robert's, not as a subordinate to a judge, but as an equal facing the man who had once thought himself untouchable. He didn't meet her gaze, but she spoke anyway, not just to him, but to everyone who had ever bowed their head in fear because of someone like him. I came into this courtroom wearing a cross, she began, her voice low but crisp. Not to provoke, not to protest, but because it's a part of who I am. You thought that made me dangerous, she paused, letting the silence carry the weight of her words. You fined me for that faith. You tried to erase it with a number on a slip of paper. You tried to bury my voice in a holding cell, 6 hours of silence and no explanation. But you didn't just fine me. You fined every teacher, every nurse, every veteran who wears their belief not on a sleeve, but in their soul. She leaned slightly forward. You thought you could fine me for my faith. Today I fine you with justice. It wasn't a punchline. It was a pronouncement. The room did not erupt. It didn't need to. The power in her words was a thunder that echoed in stillness. Jasmine didn't list her achievements. She didn't recite legal code. She told the truth in a voice that couldn't be cross-examined. She spoke of the shame that tried to wrap itself around her after being detained for doing nothing more than standing in her truth. She spoke of the fear she saw in the eyes of young staffers who whispered their stories to her after the courtroom doors closed. She spoke of every message, every letter, every citizen who said, they silenced me too. She made it clear, this trial was never just about her. It was about a disease in the system that wore the disguise of neutrality. And Roberts hadn't just infected it, he built it. When she stepped down, no one moved. Not the judge, not the jury, not the press. The silence wasn't absence. It was awe. It was the kind of silence that comes after something sacred has been said. She returned to her seat. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She folded her hands, waiting not for vindication, but for the system to prove it could finally be what it promised to be. And then came the verdict. The judge's voice, strong and sure, broke the stillness with a clarity that rang through every speaker and every screen, broadcasting across the country. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The courtroom tensed. Full damages awarded in the amount of $2.5 billion. But she didn't stop there. In addition, the judge continued, this court refers the following to the Department of Justice for federal prosecution. Count 1, willful violation of civil rights under 18 U.S. Code Section 242. Count 2, obstruction of justice through manipulation of judicial procedure. John Roberts didn't speak. He didn't move. His title was gone. His shield dismantled, his power stripped. The man who once judged millions now sat as one of them, not above the law, but beneath its judgment. And Jasmine Crockett, she didn't just win. She made history, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. And as the verdict settled into the air like the final note of a requiem, the country didn't just react, it moved. What Jasmine Crockett had done in that courtroom could not be confined to a headline or even a historical ruling. It demanded reform, real, structural, irreversible change, and the nation, still raw from the exposure of what had festered in silence for years, was no longer willing to wait for the system to correct itself. The pressure came from every corner: civil rights leaders, religious organizations, bipartisan coalitions, and everyday citizens who finally had language for a pain they had once been told to swallow. In emergency session just 3 weeks after the trial, Congress introduced what would become the most sweeping judicial reform bill in over half a century. The Religious Expression Protection and Judicial Accountability Act, quickly known by the public as the Cross Bill. The name was no accident. It was both a symbol and a promise. The bill had two core mandates, one addressing the past, the other protecting the future. First, it made it unequivocally illegal for any judge in the United States to penalize an individual for wearing, displaying, or referencing religious symbols in court, so long as it posed no threat or disruption to proceedings. This wasn't about promoting faith, it was about safeguarding freedom. The text of the bill cited the Jasmine Crockett v. Roberts decision verbatim, embedding her case directly into the spine of American law. Second, and just as groundbreaking, the bill required mandatory training for all sitting judges and future judicial appointees on First Amendment rights, specifically religious freedom. This wasn't a 2-hour ethics seminar. It was a federal certification process overseen by legal scholars, civil liberties experts, and constitutional historians. Any judge failing to complete it within the allotted time frame would be suspended from the bench. But legislation wasn't enough. What Jasmine's case revealed wasn't just an individual abuse. It was a culture of unchecked authority, nurtured behind closed courtroom doors, hidden beneath robes and legal jargon. So the second half of the reform went further than anyone had anticipated. For the first time in U.S. history, Congress passed a law to establish the Citizens Judicial Oversight Commission, a federal body composed not of judges or political appointees, but ordinary Americans, teachers, veterans, small business owners, clergy, nurses, technologists. The commission would have subpoena power, independent auditing authority, and the right to conduct annual reviews of courtroom practices nationwide. Its mandate was simple: watch the watchers. The idea had been controversial at first. Critics warned that civilians couldn't understand the complexities of judicial proceedings, that oversight of this kind could spiral into chaos. But supporters countered with a question Jasmine herself had asked during a congressional address. If the law is meant to serve the people, then why are the people the only ones without a seat at the table? That one sentence redefined the debate, and when it passed, with rare bipartisan support, cheers erupted not just on Capitol Hill, but in churches, town halls, community centers, and living rooms across America. The commission was real. It had teeth. and it bore the unmistakable fingerprints of the movement Jasmine had started. From its inception, the Citizens Judicial Oversight Commission was designed to do more than react. It would investigate reported incidents of discrimination or judicial misconduct. It would review courtroom footage flagged for inappropriate rulings, and it would produce an annual public report naming courts with patterns of biased behavior, backed by data, witness testimony, and verified legal records. Judges who ignored its recommendations could face suspension, reappointment blocks, or full removal. No longer would injustice hide behind procedure. No longer would the courtroom be immune to accountability. Justice, for the first time in decades, would answer to the people. Jasmine wasn't appointed to the commission. She declined the invitation. Instead, she chose to remain in Congress, not as a symbol, but as a sentinel. She helped write the education standards for the judicial training curriculum, working alongside constitutional scholars and historians to ensure it wasn't just about checking boxes, it was about changing hearts and minds. In a widely televised speech at the National Archives, she stood beneath the faded parchment of the Bill of Rights and said, "This country was born from the idea that belief should never be punished. It's time our courts remembered that." The impact of the Cross Bill was immediate and far-reaching. Within 6 months, over 9,000 judges across the United States completed the new certification. In courtrooms from Alaska to Alabama, court officers and clerks began attending new training programs. Old posters outlining dress codes were replaced with new ones that began with the words, "Your beliefs are protected here." Cases previously buried in sealed files were reopened. In one instance, a young man in Utah who had been fined for carrying a small Bible in traffic court had his conviction overturned. In another, a Muslim woman in Pennsylvania, who had been told to remove her hijab during testimony, was awarded restitution and a formal apology from the state. But the greatest shift was cultural. Judges began sitting a little straighter. Courtrooms, once hushed by fear of overstepping some invisible line, began to feel more like the open forums they were always meant to be. Citizens entered legal proceedings knowing they weren't just participants in a system, they were protected by it, and the nation, long fractured by political noise, found unexpected unity in the most unlikely place: the defense of freedom to believe, to speak, to show who you are. Of course, not everything changed overnight. Reform is never clean. It's slow, messy, human. There were appeals. There was resistance. Some judges resigned rather than comply with the training. Others pushed back against the authority of the Oversight Commission. But the tide had turned, and even those clinging to the old ways could feel the ground shifting beneath them. For Jasmine Crockett, the victory was never about money. It wasn't even about the verdict. It was about making sure no one else had to choose between faith and fairness. In an interview with a national magazine a year after the ruling, she said quietly, "They tried to punish me with a fine, but I never saw that cross as something I wore. I saw it as something I carried. Now I know I was never carrying it alone." The Cross Bill was signed into law in a full congressional chamber, with a stained glass rendering of the First Amendment displayed behind the podium. The pen used to sign the legislation was later given to Jasmine, who placed it beside her grandmother's Bible on her office shelf. Outside, crowds gathered not to protest, but to celebrate. Choirs sang in front of the Supreme Court. Veterans raised flags. Students read the text of the bill aloud. And etched into the marble steps of the courthouse, where Jasmine had first been fined, a new inscription was laid down, commissioned by the Citizens Commission and funded entirely by grassroots donations. It read, "Let no symbol of faith be mistaken for a threat again. This house belongs to all." And beneath it, in smaller lettering, "In memory of silence, in honor of those who spoke." The courtroom that once tried to diminish her had become a monument to her defiance. And Jasmine Crockett had proven that justice, no matter how long it hides, can be pulled back into the light and made to answer. And as the ink dried on the Cross Bill and the courthouse steps were engraved with the weight of a nation's promise, something remarkable happened. The country didn't just remember Jasmine Crockett's stand. It began to build around it. What started as a courtroom battle transformed into a civic awakening, and that momentum needed a landmark, a place that would not just symbolize the triumph of faith and justice, but cemented in the geography of power itself. The idea began humbly, proposed by a high school civics teacher in a letter to Congress. We name buildings after generals and presidents, but shouldn't there be a place named for someone who defended freedom in real time? Within weeks, the proposal was echoed by citizens across the nation. Petitions flooded D.C., online campaigns surged, and community leaders, from pastors to public defenders, joined the call. It didn't take long before the Capitol responded. In a unanimous vote from the D.C. Council, the city approved the motion to rename its historic civic centerpiece. And so, with flags raised and 1,000 voices rising in chorus, Freedom Park in the heart of Washington, D.C. became the Jasmine Crockett Liberty Square. The transformation was more than ceremonial. The newly named plaza underwent a full redesign. At its center now stands a towering monument, a polished marble arch carved with fragments of the First Amendment and crowned by a single sculpted cross, flame, crescent, and Star of David intertwined. Beneath it, engraved in bronze, are Jasmine's words from the trial. You find me for my faith. Today I find you, with justice. The day of the dedication drew a crowd of more than 50,000. Veterans held flags. Survivors of religious discrimination stood with hands clasped. Children waved handmade signs. And standing at the foot of the monument, beneath a sky as clear as the words that reshaped a nation, Jasmine Crockett addressed the crowd. She didn't speak as a politician or a plaintiff, but as someone who had stared into the machinery of silence and made it speak. We are not here today because the system was always fair, she said, her voice carried through a dozen speakers. We're here because we refuse to let it stay broken. The crowd roared, but Jasmine's expression remained steady. This wasn't a moment of personal glory. It was a victory shared by everyone who had once been told to remove their symbol, bite their tongue, or step aside. That same week, Jasmine received an official letter from the White House. It was short, direct, and signed by the president. It read, "In light of your defense of religious liberty, your leadership in reform, and your courage under fire, we invite you to serve as the first ever national advisor on religious freedom and judicial equity." It was a position that didn't previously exist, but was now a permanent cabinet-adjacent post, designed to monitor policy decisions, advise on court-related legislation, and act as a liaison between citizens and the Department of Justice on matters of religious expression. Jasmine's response was measured. She requested time to pray, to reflect. But deep down, she already knew her answer. Because for Jasmine, justice was never a finish line. It was a responsibility. She accepted the appointment in a press conference, not with flair, but with resolve. This isn't about protecting one religion, she told the nation. It's about protecting the right to believe at all, and to do so without fear. Her office was placed 2 doors down from the Attorney General. Her first act was to convene a national summit on faith-based civil liberties, inviting leaders from all backgrounds, including those of no faith. The goal wasn't to elevate one belief, it was to make room for all beliefs anchored in dignity, equal under law. Her daily responsibilities now range from overseeing education policy on religious rights, to flagging court practices that bordered on discrimination, to chairing the very commission she had helped build from the ashes of injustice. But she never grew distant. She never cloaked herself in title. She still answered personal letters from students who wrote, "You made me feel like I can wear my cross again." She still walked through Liberty Square on her way home from hearings, pausing at the monument, running her fingers across the words carved into stone. That plaza became more than a memorial. It became a destination. Schools brought field trips. Faith groups came for sunrise prayers. Veterans returned to recount what they fought for. And each year, on the anniversary of the verdict, bells rang from churches, mosques, and synagogues across the city at exactly 10:03 a.m. The moment the gavel had fallen and the law finally bowed to truth. But Jasmine never let the reverence cloud the mission. In her view, the monument wasn't the end, it was the beginning. In meetings, she reminded officials that faith was not decoration, it was identity. In hearings, she told lawmakers, neutrality must never mean erasure. And in quiet moments, walking past the place where she had once been, fined $2,500 for the necklace she wore now every day, she whispered only to herself, They tried to make me choose between my God and my country. They didn't know I served both. Her story became part of school textbooks, civil rights seminars, even legal training modules. Judges recited her case in confirmation hearings. Civil liberties groups adopted her strategies, and her name, once just a line on a court docket, was now woven into the conscience of a country that had almost forgotten how fragile justice can be when left unguarded. And so the square remained, beating in the center of the Capitol like a living promise, a place built not from power, but from pressure, from scars that became statements, from silence that became law. It reminded every passerby of a simple truth. Symbols only matter when someone dares to carry them into fire. And Jasmine Crockett had done just that, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in something and needed the law to believe in them back. But Liberty Square was just the epicenter. The real aftershock, the true force of change, was felt across all 50 states. What Jasmine Crockett ignited in one courtroom did not stay confined to Washington, D.C. Her case became the cornerstone of a national reckoning, a legal and cultural awakening that swept across America like a wildfire fueled by 5 decades of silent suppression. It didn't matter if you were in a metropolitan high-rise or a rural town with one blinking streetlight. People saw the footage, read the verdict, heard the voice that refused to tremble. They didn't just agree, they mobilized. Within a month, the trial transcripts were downloaded over 6 million times. Civil liberties organizations saw record donations pour in overnight. Faith leaders across denominations held emergency meetings. Governors, many of whom had stayed silent during the proceedings, began issuing executive orders instructing their judicial branches to review courtroom policy, some for the first time in decades. It wasn't political pressure, it was moral gravity. Jasmine had done what no committee or commission could. She made justice feel personal again. The legal world responded first. In Texas, the state legislature passed the Faith and Fairness Act, codifying protections for all individuals wearing religious symbols in state buildings. Ohio followed suit, then Georgia, then Illinois. Within 6 months, over 30 states had enacted some variation of the cross bill. But some went further. Minnesota allocated a $10 million fund to compensate citizens previously fined for religious expression. Colorado launched a statewide initiative to audit 20 years of courtroom records involving faith-based penalties. In every piece of legislation, Jasmine's name appeared, no longer just a line in a federal complaint, but now a permanent footnote in the pages of state constitutions. But the changes weren't confined to paper. In courtrooms, everything shifted. Bailiffs who once gave quiet warnings about necklaces or head coverings now stood trained, respectful, and informed. Judges underwent mandatory First Amendment training, and not just the old online modules. They attended immersive workshops, some taught by those who had once been silenced. Judicial review boards were expanded and empowered. The old discretionary codes, written in vague language about professional appearance, were replaced by one clear directive. Belief is not a disruption. Culturally, the ripple effect became a wave. In Boise, Idaho, a school teacher allowed her class to wear any religious pin, patch, or symbol they chose during testing week. No one raised a complaint. In Kansas City, students reenacted Jasmine's trial as part of a debate competition, their performances ending in standing ovations. In Philadelphia, churches and mosques co-hosted unity nights where lawyers explained faith rights over dinner and hymns. And in Atlanta, Georgia, 10,000 citizens gathered outside the federal courthouse for a candlelight vigil. They wore crosses, stars of David, hijabs, turbans, and held signs that read, visible, vocal, protected. Social media became its own court of revolution. Hashtags like Bashi Faith on Trial, Josh Crockett Doctrine, and Bashi Visible by Right exploded across platforms. TikTokers reenacted her courtroom speech in slow motion, overlaying her voice on orchestral scores. Instagram Reels broke down the key moments of the case. YouTube creators dissected the cross bill, bringing in legal scholars and faith leaders. Jasmine's testimony became a soundbite of defiance and clarity, quoted in sermons, graduation speeches, and even rap lyrics. Overnight, the internet had turned her stand into a movement, and that movement had momentum. Education systems caught on. Law schools rewrote curricula to include Crockett versus Roberts as a foundational case in constitutional law. Debate teams made it standard material. Mock trial programs from high schools to pre-law academies used it as their final exercise of the year. A professor at Harvard described it as Brown v. Board, but for belief. What made it different was its modern context. It was televised, dissected, streamed, and shared in real time. The nation hadn't just read about Jasmine's courage, they had witnessed it. Faith communities mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Churches, temples, mosques, and spiritual centers of all kinds formed state coalitions to report discrimination, educate members, and create faith and law task forces. Interfaith networks emerged to track violations in real time and report them to the Citizens Judicial Oversight Commission. These were no longer just places of worship. They were frontline agencies in the preservation of American freedom. Some used Jasmine's quote as a new greeting sign, "Your faith belongs here." Perhaps the most powerful shift, though, was in the daily lives of ordinary people. In DMV lines, in school auditoriums, in government buildings, people no longer tucked their necklaces away or hesitated before saying a prayer in public. They stood taller. They walked freely. One woman in Nebraska, wearing her grandmother's rosary in a courthouse for the first time in years, was quoted saying, "I didn't realize how much I'd hidden myself until I didn't have to anymore." That was the legacy Jasmine had sparked. Not pride, not vengeance, but visibility. Of course, the road wasn't smooth. Resistance came from predictable corners. A judge in Arizona refused to comply with the crossbill's training requirements. He was publicly removed within 30 days. A courthouse in Florida was caught suppressing religious expression through unspoken customs. The Oversight Commission acted within 72 hours, launching a formal investigation and suspending multiple staff. For the first time in U.S. history, a courthouse was held legally accountable by civilian authority in real time. The old power structures weren't just questioned, they were dismantled. The media called it the Jasmine effect. Editorials poured in. News networks ran nightly specials. Time magazine named her Person of the Year. But Jasmine never leaned into the spotlight. She didn't tour or celebrate. Instead, she returned to the same office, wore the same necklace, and kept working. "This movement isn't about me," she told a crowd in Chicago. "It's about making sure no one ever has to do what I had to do, just to be seen." The results spoke for themselves. Within 18 months, the Citizens Commission logged a 62% drop in faith-based complaints across courtrooms. Instances of religious visibility in public institutions rose by over 400%. Public confidence in judicial fairness hit its highest rating in 2 decades. But more than numbers, it was the stories that echoed loudest. A teenage boy in Oklahoma who wasn't told to remove his cross. A Sikh man in Michigan who wore his Kara bracelet into court without fear. A Muslim girl in Virginia who wore her hijab to give testimony and was thanked by the judge for her courage. They didn't just feel included, they felt protected. And through it all, one name kept rising, not shouted, not chanted, but spoken in gratitude, in reverence, in change. Jasmine. Not as a politician, not as a martyr, but as a reminder that a single act of defiance, rooted in truth, can do what institutions often fail to do, restore belief in what justice is supposed to be. This wasn't just a legal shift, it was a cultural restoration, a promise, long broken, finally kept. Years passed, but Jasmine Crockett's legacy didn't fade. It crystallized. The courtroom where she once stood accused became a landmark visited by law students and tourists alike. Judges who had once dismissed her as a political upstart now cited her case in their rulings. Her words were etched not just into the marble of Liberty Square, but into the policies, mindsets, and memories of a country forever shifted by her defiance. What she had done could not be undone. What she had awakened could not be silenced again. She refused every title that tried to wrap itself around her like a crown. Senate seats were offered. Cabinet roles proposed. Even rumors of presidential bids circulated. Jasmine declined them all. "I don't need a throne," she once said. "I just need a desk, a window, and a line to the people." Her office never moved from its modest floor in the same federal building where she had once filed her suit. The same window, the same cross on the wall, the same daily prayer. But her influence radiated far beyond that space. She became the standard against which truth was measured. New judges recited lines from her trial during their swearing-in ceremonies. Legal ethics courses across the nation used her confrontation with Roberts as a core case study. Civil rights attorneys carried printed excerpts of her testimony like scripture. When new legal movements arose against surveillance, against algorithmic bias, against digital censorship, they all cited her case. Because Jasmine hadn't just defended freedom of faith, she had redefined what it meant to fight for it. And she kept working. Year after year, no gala fundraisers, no best-selling memoir. She drafted quiet reforms that reshaped the justice system, including a bill mandating mental health evaluations for judges with disciplinary histories, and another that required live streaming of all public courtroom proceedings. Her name didn't always appear on the bills. She didn't care. She wasn't chasing credit. She was chasing consistency. She gave speeches, yes, but never on red carpets. She spoke at prisons, at synagogues, at inner-city schools, and on reservations where the justice system had failed people for generations. One viral moment came when she addressed a packed high school gym in South Dakota. The students fell silent as she paused, then said, "Don't wait to be told you matter. Build something that proves it." On the 10th anniversary of the trial, Liberty Square overflowed. The ceremony was simple. No fireworks, just voices. Veterans read from the Constitution. A children's choir sang a gospel hymn. And beneath the towering arch, engraved with the First Amendment, a new plaque was unveiled. It read, "She stood, we followed, and the law remembered who it serves." Jasmine stood in the crowd that day, not on stage. She wore the same navy blue blazer, the same silver cross. She didn't speak until the cameras were gone. Then, surrounded by ordinary citizens, she whispered, "This square doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who still walks into a courtroom wondering if the law sees them. This is the answer." Her legacy lived not in fame, but in function. The Citizens Judicial Oversight Commission, her brainchild, became one of the most trusted institutions in the country. With bipartisan credibility and citizen leadership, it handled thousands of cases of judicial misconduct. It didn't just punish corruption, it prevented it. People knew that if something went wrong, someone was watching. In schools, Jasmine's story became a fixture of civic education. Children recited her name alongside Susan B. Anthony and Rosa Parks. Classroom walls displayed her, quote, "The robe does not outrank the right." Parents told their children about the woman who turned a $2,500 fine into a $2.5 billion victory, not for herself, but for them. But perhaps the most enduring proof of her impact came in the smallest places, in waiting rooms and jury boxes, in clerks' offices. A judge in Louisiana began every session by saying, "Let this court remember who it serves." A courthouse in Oregon installed a plaque outside its main entrance reading, "Visible, vocal, protected." In dozens of towns, churches rang bells on the anniversary of her verdict, calling their communities to remember the day the system blinked and woke up. And Jasmine? She aged, she slowed down, but she never stopped. In her final public address before retiring from her advisory post, she stood once more under the marble arch of Liberty Square. The sky was overcast, but her voice was steady. "They told me the system was too big to change, that it was made of stone. But what they forgot is that stone can be carved." She placed her palm on the monument, the same place her name was engraved, and added, "And we carved it together." The applause didn't erupt, it rose. Not like thunder, like sunrise. And as the crowd began to leave, a little girl walked up to the base of the monument and traced the letters of Jasmine's name with her finger. Her mother watched quietly. "Who is she?" the girl asked. The mother smiled, knelt beside her, and said, "She's the reason you don't have to hide what you believe." And long after the crowds had gone home, after the lights dimmed around Liberty Square, and the speeches faded into memory, something quieter and far more powerful remained. the lesson. Because this story, at its core, was never just about Jasmine Crockett or a courtroom or a silver cross. It was about what happens when power forgets its purpose, and when a single voice dares to remind it. It showed how easily law can become weapon when left unchecked, how silence can become complicity, and how dignity can be dismissed with the stroke of a fine. But it also revealed something extraordinary, that courage, when rooted in conviction, can shake institutions more effectively than rage. That justice is not a fortress, it is a mirror. And the moment someone stands before it with truth, it reflects everything we've denied. Jasmine didn't win because she shouted the loudest. She won because she refused to bow. And in doing so, she taught an entire nation how to stand again. The real lesson wasn't in the verdict or the monument. It was in the ordinary moments. A girl walking into a courthouse wearing her grandmother's necklace. A boy no longer asked to hide his prayer book. A judge who now opens every session with a silent reminder of who the court belongs to. It was in the quiet shift from fear to presence, from hiding to being seen. This was a story about one woman, but it became a story about all of us, about what we accept, what we ignore, and what we're finally willing to challenge. Jasmine didn't change the country alone. She reminded the country that it could change, and she left behind not just laws or landmarks, but a blueprint for every person who has ever been told they don't belong. Speak, stand, stay, because belief should never come with a penalty, and silence should never be the price of dignity. That was her lesson, and now it's ours to carry. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.